Good morning, friends. We are on Chapter 7. Winter is coming. The December of 2012 was one of the coldest I could remember. At 2 a.m., my mother dispatched me... 2 a.m. At 2 a.m., my mother dispatched me to the Narja's bakery because it was one of the few that opened early. My mission was to buy as much bread as I could. Even though the blizzard had just stopped, the wind kept howling. I wore 2 sweaters, my woolen scarf, and the heaviest jacket I had. The bread shortages had worn down a population that was accustomed to eating bread with every meal. The governorate was clueless on how to provide sufficient quantities of flour for the bakeries. The rebels, who had practically surrounded the city, held the silos that spread across the countryside, forcing the local authority to negotiate sales at higher prices. The consumer paid for the hike. Raqqa, along with the neighboring provinces of Dir ez-Zor and Haseke, was nicknamed the breadbasket of the whole country. But that winter, the cost of one loaf mounted to 20 Syrian pounds, 10 times the price from the previous month. People crowded in front of bakeries, small windows for hours, squeezing, shoving each other, sometimes punching and cursing. If you were short, you would suffocate. If you were weak, you'd be thrown away. No law in the world can contain hungry mouths and empty stomachs. It was the perverse twin of the scene I saw as a teenage pilgrim beside my father in Mecca, when people shoved and climbed over each other to kiss the small black stone. But here, where I was standing, they fought from neither passion nor holiness, just an animal craving to eat. That specific baker had organized a line. I counted 186 before me. I was hoping to reach the high, tiny hole by 8 a.m. when the bakery closed. I was told that the baker had secured enough supply to run until then. Minutes after I arrived, my mind started racing. Surely this is temporary. It will end when the rebels come. It's a siege situation. The rebels are going to break through fast and lift it. They care what we think about them. But do they? Aren't they the reason I'm standing here? Aren't they the reason these people are behaving like animals? Or not? Some say that the Department of Subsidies is making a profit from this situation, and also that the government officials want us to hate the rebels in advance. Perhaps the government accuses the rebels of running a monopoly, so that we will view the government as protectors and the rebels as gangs. Perhaps they want us to think this is how bad it is before they even enter the city. You can imagine what will happen when they take over. It wasn't just the bread. The rebels, our liberators, had also taken most of the oil fields in Raqqa and Dir ez-Zor, and they cut off the pipelines through which crude flowed to the other side of the country. With gasoline in short supply, cars lined up in front of gas stations for days. As the conditions grew worse, the government sent police to control the crowds at gas stations. Several times, disputes over the long car lines developed into shootings. Diesel used for heating became an impossible luxury, so residents turned to wood. Chopping down trees became a highly lucrative endeavor. Within months, the forests in Raqqa's outskirts had vanished. Only parks and sidewalk trees were spared. Soon this should end. A few days' hunger is silly to complain about when we are living through a revolution that aims to change our lives for the better. Patience is the key to the redress of hardships, they say. I personally should embrace this cost. I should be fine. I will return with my family's daily sustenance in hand. I have plans. I'm going to tutor kids, work in my field, apply for the MBA program at the Syrian Virtual University, tweet in hope and anger, and endure. I looked at these people, desperate, angry, and scared. They were scared to blame the rebels who were about to enter the city. The rebels had supporters, many. They had a long hand, it was whispered. They quietly assassinated Abu Ladim Shiko, my teacher at elementary school, who led the prayer last Eid, when Assad visited the city for the first time in the hopes of showing the world that he had support. Oh, the revolutionaries berated Raqqa for that one. Employees, teachers, supporters, tribesmen, and union members were all press-ganged by the government for a rally in the general square. Friends told me how they faked, for their bosses, reasons to excuse themselves from participating. One of them claimed that he had attended, but not a single one of his co-workers had caught a glimpse of him. They were also scared to criticize the government officials or the soldiers, both of whom had their own doors through which to enter the bakeries and load their pickups with hundreds of pounds of bread right in front of our yearning eyes. No one dared say a word. The government might stay in power. They had proved well enough that they were ruthless. We might fight each other for a sack of bread, but before the men with guns we were meek and humble, in a compliance that was its own species of humiliation. Oh, how politely the powerless must behave. I am freezing. Time is passing slow, the line slower. I want my bed. It's 6 a.m. now. I don't think I'll reach that damn window. Now people are saying it'll close soon. I wish it was only me. I'd eat rice, vegetables, anything. Surely I can survive with no bread. But it's the family. It's about my old parents who could never adapt to life without bread. I'm going to stay. I'm going to get enough loaves of bread, then go back and see my mother smile. I fooled myself that I could go back to normality. Already, people were romanticizing the past. The phrase, we used to, opened hell and poisoned their minds. We used to get bread 10 times cheaper and in minutes. Now we stand in line for hours and still go back home with empty hands, they said. We used to walk in the streets at 2 a.m. and find restaurants and grocery shops open. And then there was the lights never blinked off before the events. Events, they were called. Events, just like the events of the early 1980s when our national army had been deep into another war with Syrian Islamists who called themselves the Muslim Brothers. That short word drew a curtain over the captain, a Muslim Brotherhood member who slaughtered dozens of his cadets at the Aleppo Artillery College, as well as over the siege on Aleppo that followed to put down the insurgency. Events especially covered up the fate of Hadath. Those clipped syllables hid the tens of thousands who died in 1982 in Hama, the curious disappearance of the old city, the tunnels beneath it pumped with diesel and set alight, as the army burned out not just insurgents but history itself. One did not need to mention the year 1982, the year that old Hama vanished. The word events was enough. Events that eat up humans, that drown memories that we never speak of again. The regime thought they could bury the events of 2011 in the same way. At first they denied that the protest even existed, calling protesters infiltrators and vandals. Then they insisted on ending the protests at any cost. The whole security apparatus was deployed in the streets, and wherever they failed, the army was sent to their aid. Starting from Daraa, the government decided to crack down on rebellious cities one by one, and by 2012, the idea that peaceful opposition could still lead us to revolution had faded into fantasy. The call to arms became a selling point, and soon, with army defection spreading across the country, the events slid into a civil war. On the opposition side, endless brigades hatched, disunited in their efforts and goals. Local groups started to form in the Raqqa countryside, and soon, with help from insurgents from the neighboring towns, they isolated the city with little effort. News of rebel groups' violations, from looting to murder, preceded them. They were besieging regime forces, and behind them lay the open Turkish border, through which goods flooded for the first time since it had been drawn nearly a century ago. Better to cut off one's neck than to cut off their livelihood, the saying goes. Rakkans longed for one side to win so that the siege would finally lift. We knew the regime firsthand in all its brutality and intransigence. The rebels were unknown, but they said that they fought in our names. Perhaps they might be open to our influence. Raqqa stood at a fork between two potential futures, prison versus anarchy. People were too cautious, and I don't blame them for that. They were selfish, too. One guy asked me why he should care as long as his business was bringing in money. I despised him until my own doubts began. If I were living a satisfying life, if I were on the road to fulfilling my dreams, would I have participated so quickly? I might have blamed those reckless protesters. Zealous, undisciplined youths, I might have said. What that man could not see was that our country was different now, speeding fast, with no way back to the place we came from. There's a saying that Nael liked to repeat in the days leading up to his arrest. What's taken from you by force can only be retrieved by force. Can we repel a tank shell? I once asked Nael. Yes, we can, he snapped back, but with bullets. A frightening spark shone in his eyes. Of course, Nael didn't stand on the breadline with me. He wasn't the waiting kind. He was the one who hustled money for our cigarettes, who dragged the weak out of demonstrations when the gas and the crowds overcame them. He had never shared my hesitation. In October, Nael had traveled to a town 30 miles west of Raqqa to meet the leader of the local guerrilla group Arar al-Tabqa. We had grown so far apart that it took his family 3 weeks to tell me. Nael had joined the rebels. And here I was, standing online in the freezing morning, giving a damn about nothing but a sack of bread. Time passed. It was 8 a.m. The window was closed. and I was on my way home, empty-handed, sad, ashamed. I saw the disappointment in my mother's eyes. I cursed the bread. Bread is the blessing of God, she would say. You can't curse what comes from God, she said. Have a good day, friends.